We're speaking with James Henry, Senior Fellow, Columbia University Center on Sustainable Investment, and he's talking about his investigations into Donald Trump's connection with Russia and how we've been describing it for the last 10 minutes, how Russia is, or Russian oligarchs and top wealthy owners of the Russian industry basically provided money to float Donald Trump's businesses, I guess, for decades. I think his first visit was in 1987. It was that far back?
Yeah, that's right. July 1987, he goes to Moscow. And, I suspect U.S. Intelligence community was keeping an eye on him there. He met with some high-level people. But the point about that is that, this illustrates the point that Donald Trump has had long-standing relationships with Russia. I mean, the collusion of last year's election may or may not, have taken place and may have been important. But the key point is that as of 1987, he was already long before Putin took power in 2000. He was there cultivating long-standing relationships with all kinds of people. And he comes back actually from that trip in September 1, 1987. You can still find the full-page ads that he took out, kind of out of the blue, really. He's a real estate guy, in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe, decrying the fact that the United States was spending so much money on NATO, defending the Persian Gulf, Japan. I mean, just following the line with respect to what the Soviet Union's messaging was at that point, as if he was trying to cultivate his new friends in Moscow. So that's a very peculiar pattern over time that Donald Trump, who was from a New York real estate developer, basically taking on U.S. foreign policy.
Some of the people, you mentioned earlier a company called Bayrock, and there was a chain of connections that seemed to be linked to Donald Trump, and especially his Soho, his Trump Tower Soho hotel, which you said recently is going under. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about who the people behind the Bayrock and the other companies in Iceland you mentioned that financed Donald Trump for so many years. What do we know? Yeah,
well, Bayrock is a company that gets started in the early 2000s. The organizer of it was a former Soviet trade minister from Kazakhstan, Tufts Arif, who showed up in Brooklyn in the 1990s and set up Bayrock around 1999. But they hired as the director, kind of off the books, a guy named Felix Seder. Felix had come here with his father, who was, according to the FBI, a reputed member of the Moscow Mafia, in the late 80s. And 1991, he's convicted for stabbing somebody in the neck with a margarita glass. 1998, he has a plea bargain where he is involved in a $40 million financial fraud involving stock manipulation. That unfortunately, all the records pertaining to that conviction in the Eastern District of New York were sealed because he cooperated, apparently, with the prosecutor, who was Loretta Lynch. And so, in fact, the new deputy for Mueller, who's just been appointed special counsel, is a guy, Andrew Weissman, who worked on that prosecution, was involved in sealing those documents. So Seder then goes on to become an executive at Bayrock.
Yes, I wanted to mention, just go on the seal, because there was actual emails in which the Justice Department, the prosecutors, told people to take out Seder's name from the documents.
Well, that's right. And so in a way, one of the embarrassing sidelines here is that the FBI and the Justice Department, and this is kind of a bipartisan problem, really, were involved in sort of making it possible for people like Seder, to kind of have this Whitey Bulger protection. And, he went on to successfully organize
the Boston-based Irish-American mobster who is famous for being an informant while being a criminal at the same time and doing well in both, right?
Exactly. So in this case, we have Seder kind of allowed to do business and to build Bayrock into a partnership with Trump. He actually ends up carrying a Trump Organization business card as of 2009. In 2009, he's finally sentenced for the 1998 infractions. He gets $25,000 fine and no jail time. But during this whole period before that, he was able to raise money, to negotiate deals all over the planet, to organize at least a half dozen projects in which Trump had his name on the buildings, and to go on as if he were not. Now, that would have been extremely important to the other investors in those projects. But, we believe that Trump was put on notice as of December 2007, at least. And did he go and tell his investors that he was, dealing with felons? No. He actually seems to have asked for a higher share of the deal.
That's required by law to inform investors that
absolutely.
Owner... Yeah.
And if you're involved in projects like the Baku Hill, Trump Tower, $400 million project, and you find out that people are paying bribes or involved in corruption locally, you're required as a U.S. Business investor to do due diligence on that under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. No evidence that Trump really did any due diligence on his projects.
When he's confronted, he has been confronted by reporters about his connections to Bayrock, to Seder, to Tarif, and to others.
Yeah, he's been confronted. The BBC had a great confrontation with him in 2013. One of the major stories about theme songs here, we can. You mentioned the Dutch documentary. I think it's shameful that the only really decent documentary reporting on this has been done by the German public television network, by the Dutch television network. We had reports that ABC Brian Ross did an investigation of Bayrock before the election when it could have made a difference as early as 2015, and it was killed reportedly by the Disney Corporation, which didn't want to undermine Trump because he was good for ratings. Similar questions about where was 60 Minutes on this story? They also turned down the Panama Papers. We know that. The tree fell in the forest and nobody was there to hear it. So I guess
well, fortunately,
where was U.S. broadcast media during the period when it really could have counted on all these criminal connections?
We have WBAI, which is People's Radio here in New York City, and fortunately we are sitting on top of the Empire State Building with a 50,000-watt transmitter and trying to tell the story. As usual, BAI and Pacifica Radio telling the story that nobody else wants to tell in the United States. Our guest is James Henry. He's a senior fellow from Columbia University Center on Sustainable Investment, a global justice fellow at Yale University, and he has been doing an investigation into as we've been discussing for the last 15 or 16 minutes, the Russian ties, the dubious friends of Donald Trump, the Russians, and that the Russians aren't the only ones. Have you been doing any investigations into Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner?
Well, Kushner's interesting. He did a deal with an Israeli guy who owns a big investor in a company called Africa Israel, and the Dutch second documentary in that series covered this fellow's involvement in blood diamonds in Angola. But he was a partner with Kushner in buying the old New York Times building, and has also been surfaced in connection with some of the companies involved in the Magnitsky story. These stories are complicated. That's one of the problems. I wrote a 10,000-word piece about Trump and all these connections and the American interest that people can find online back in December. And it's had 400,000 downloads, but it's a long read. There are a lot of strange names in there, but that's where you're going to find some of these tales about the networks that are involved. And it's only when you really look not at the individual stories about Kushner or Leviev or these magnates, but if you put them all together in a kind of overall roadmap that you really see all the connections and an overwhelming level of evidence here that we've assembled.
How could
I mean, the latest thing? You're
Yes.
in the Empire State Building.
Yes.
This is a great example. I mean, who owns the Empire State Building today? Qatar, the Emir of Qatar, and has been has been very active doing deals with Russia. Tillerson on election day was meeting with the Emir of Qatar. We've just seen, I think, one of the most important deliverables that Trump had to offer to the oil industry and to the interests like Qatar and Russia was today's decision about climate change. I mean, that is, I think, a clear-cut example of where, he's doing a U-turn on U.S. policy. And, Russia has been vehement about opposing green technology. They don't have any green technology. Very worried about a world in which fossil fuel demand is curtailed. Similarly, the Middle Eastern countries like the Saudis and Qatar, sitting on 13% of the world's gas reserves, Qatar alone. Qatar is a great example of a country that has some very non-transparent relationships with the people in the Tillerson Trump circle.
Mm-hmm. It's what you're saying to me is mind-boggling. The reason I called you is when I saw this documentary and all these things are laid out. And there's other Mogilevich, a guy who's on the FBI 10 most wanted list, who's connected to Trump, and then there's the Krapenoff family, who is also wanted all over the world by Interpol, and they are also involved in all of this. It seems to be one criminal after another, and it just amazes me that this man's become president of the United States with these kind of connections. It's hard to believe that it's possible, but it is. It happened. We're living it right now. The nightmare is true. How is it possible that he became president, and how are the people who think that this is shocking? Well, let me put it this way: is this guy a Manchurian candidate? I hate to use that term because it's a pregnant term full of venom against people Asian, but at the same time we know what it means. There's been 2 movies about it. Is this guy like a plant of the Russian government to seize America from the inside?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, there's 2 theories of the case here. One, I think the jury is out on the question of the kind of secret coordination and collusion that went on last year in the election. I think it's possible that there were deals done, but I'm not. I'm more struck with the stuff that's hiding in plain view, which is the history of kind of quasi-criminal deals and networks that we have tolerated. I mean, from that standpoint, it's more like Trump is a Berlusconi type. Gangster figure than he is, or sort of than he is anybody's pawn. He's had a long-standing relationship with Russia, as we saw. It doesn't just start last year. It's more like it doesn't require a conspiracy. It's more like a self-organizing group of, it's kind of like the Star Wars bar scene, where you have the kleptocrats and the tax dodgers and the organized criminal types, and they're all coming together and they're doing deals. And the thing that unites them is the interest in, a total lack of scruples about who they'll do business with, and, as long as they can get away with it. So that's more of the pattern here. And I think, if I were Putin, I would say, God, beware of what we asked for. We've got somebody who's going to be, totally unscrupulous.
So he's basically, you think that Trump and his cronies are basically in this to enrich themselves less than set up a Fourth Reich or something to that effect. It's more like
I don't see much consistent principled ideology coming out of Donald Trump. I think that the most important consistent characteristic of him is his willingness to, his search for self-aggrandizement, his need for ego stroking and gratification, and his, sort of consistent pattern of overstating his success as a business person, to all of his followers, who never really bothered to research the truth about how much he's really worth or what he's really accomplished. All these failures in the past, there's just a litany of projects. You can barely point to a single project, except maybe the Trump Tower itself, which is absolutely filled to the gills with mobsters. I mean, the 51st floor was inhabited by a gambling ring. There's a guy who was convicted of gasoline tax fraud who bought 5 apartments in the Trump Towers. And he had spent the Vietnam War. I mean, John McCain should find this amusing. He was, during the Vietnam War, operating an anti-aircraft guns in Hanoi for the Soviets, shooting down U.S. jets. But, this is a pattern of, typical kind of, racketeering, as opposed to some grand conspiracy.
Could Donald Trump be indicted for crimes like racketeering or conspiracy?
I think in principle, the statute of limitations on money laundering goes back 10 years. Securities fraud, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. These are all federal statutes that, you really have to get down into the details of particular projects. But if I were advising, the Mueller, I would not limit my investigation to simply the collusion issue or the, tilting of the election issue. It may be easy to lay a lot of the activity off on people like Flynn or Manafort, who are really pretty extreme. And, Trump walks away from that. There's also such a lot of money on the table here compared to, say, under Nixon.
Yeah.
You're talking about corporate tax cuts, this kind of land grab that's going on for, federally owned properties where they're privatizing. Yeah. They want to privatize infrastructure and have $1 trillion infrastructure program that's going to benefit people like Blackstone. This is a land grab. And I think to characterize it as anything else really is to, assume that Trump has values other than, profit maximization.
Do you think we'll ever see his taxes?
I think the U.S. Congress, if it does a decent investigation of this thing, actually what we need now is not just the special prosecutor. We need, as I said, I think the FBI and the Justice Department have conflicts of interest here of their own, given their history of protecting people like Seder. I think what we need is a national commission on this issue that's filled with serious jurists and people with a track record that isn't necessarily tied to any one party, but is just first-rate, hard-hitting investigators.
Right. Like yourself. Like you've been doing a wonderful job. James Henry, Senior Fellow, Columbia University, Center on Sustainable Investment, talking about Donald Trump. We have about a minute and a half left. I wanted to give you an opportunity to sum up the story. What do you think? Where do you think this is going in the immediate future as far as the Trump presidency?
Well, I think we're going to have much more pressure put on the Congress to actually investigate this stuff if we're going to have any of the facts publicly come out in finite time. And we don't know how long. The special prosecutors, special counsels can, the Iran-Contra or previous ones are any test. It can take a couple years. And I don't think we have that long. We want to have the evidence out in public, in time to have an impact on the 2018 election. The second point is, this is not really a partisan issue. I mean, anybody who cares about the rule of law and our democratic institutions should be concerned about what's going on here. And we've seen, Democrats try to explain, the loss in the 2016 election attributed to Russia. I think that's far too simple. But what we really do know is we have somebody in office who's capable of, I have this quote in my article about Cervantes, saying, you are who you walk with. And we have a guy who's been walking with, spending a lot of time with all the sorts of people that none of us would really want to spend time with. Uh-huh. That's the concern that I have about this. To get this investigation off the dime, the public side of the investigation, we need sustained involvement from the American people.
All right. Thank you very much, James Henry.